Hey folks, I'm Chuck Block. We're doing 52 weeks of Python in 10-minute sessions. Today's topic is JSON. That is the conversion of data that is formatted in JSON format into Python data structures and vice versa. And this is the first of a number of lessons that I'll be doing that deals with YAML and XML and CSV as well. So let's get started. Okay, so we're moving into this next area, which I called files in the code. That's probably not the best description, although quite often our files are stored in YAML or XML or CSV format. JSON maybe not so much, but the basic idea of what we're doing here is we're translating data from one format to another. So if you look at this picture, in this situation I have inventory, which is an example from the code that we'll be using. And this inventory is in Python format. Here you see a square bracket, here you see a curly bracket, here you see a key and value pair. What that looks like in JSON is going to be quite similar. Square bracket refers to an array in JSON, and what we call the curly braces thing with key value pairs. In Python, it's a dictionary. In JSON, we refer to this as an object. In YAML, the format is a little bit different. You have the same idea of lists and key value pairs, but it's much more concise. And in XML, it's much more verbose, but you have these tags that identify the different types of data that is being defined. And so in the next section, what we'll be doing, the next section meaning this one right here, we'll be talking about JSON, YAML, XML, and CSV. So let's look specifically at JSON, since that's the topic of this lesson now. When you compare Python to JSON, you're going to see that it's very similar. We have the square brackets, curly brackets, key value pairs, etc. Don't worry about the formatting in terms of new lines and stuff. That doesn't matter because it's all defined by the braces and the colons and things of that nature. You can spread it out however you like. So the two are very similar, and the question is, how do you go from one to another? Because in JSON, this is one string. So when you're dealing with JSON data in the Python programming language, it will be one gigantic string that has all this stuff in it. And we want to take this string and convert it into the data structures that you see here. This would be a list. This would be a dictionary. That would be a key and the value. Key and the value is a dictionary. And inside that dictionary, there's a key value, etc. This is a string. This is a Python data structure, and then we want to be able to go back and forth, and what we're going to be looking at with this code now is how do we do that. So let's look visually at what is going on in the code that we'll be looking at. In Python, we have dictionaries. Those are JSON objects. Python lists are called JSON arrays. When we want to take data that is in JSON format and translate it into Python data structure, then we use load_s, which stands for load string. When we want to go from a Python data structure into JSON, then we use dump_s. Now at a high level, let me go through what this code does, and you may need to slow it down and just make sure you understand. First thing is I'm going to import from this L00 inventory file inventory. Inventory is a Python data structure. It has a list of dictionary items. It's really basically two different devices that it has stored. So what we're going to do is we're going to use that thing called inventory. And what we're going to do first is we are going to open this file for writing, and we are going to write out that JSON inventory using mechanisms that are available for translation. I'm going to go into those later. So basically we take the Python data and we write it out. Then we read back in that exact data. So we're going to do a read of the thing that I just wrote out, and we're going to read it back in, and that will be my JSON inventory. Now that at that point is in a string format, okay, the JSON data that we have read back in. Now I do some print statements and conversion of stuff, but then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to load that inventory that I've read into a variable, and then I'm going to compare what was read, what was written and then read with the original. Inventory is the original. And if it works, I'm going to say okay, that worked. And if it didn't, then I will print out an error message. And in the midst of this, which I'm going to describe next, are all of the JSON tools for making this happen. Now, I said all of the JSON tools. There really aren't that many. I'm importing JSON, and I'm just going to do two things. In one situation, I'm going to call json.dumps. That stands for dump string. And what it does is it takes a Python data structure and it dumps it, and the end result is that it's going to be a JSON string, which I then write out. So don't get confused by all of the file writing here. I'm basically doing this thing right here, this dump s, which is going to take Python and dump it into JSON string format. Then the next thing that I'm going to do is, after I've read it back in, this is just a string, down here I'm going to do a load string. So I'm basically going to take this JSON string, I'm going to load it, and the end result is going to be a Python data structure. So that is what is happening here. I'm taking the JSON data, I'm doing a load string, which puts it into Python data structure format. That way I compare this new thing that has been written and then read and then converted again with the original to make sure that it is the same. And just for fun, in this print statement here, what do? I do them both. I take the string, I do a load string, that puts it into a Python data structure. Then I do a dump string, which is going to put it back into a JSON string. Now, the reason that I do that is I modify the indentation and it makes it look a little bit nicer, etc. But basically, I'm doing both of those. But the two functions that I call in the JSON package are going to be load string to go from a string into Python data, and dump string, which is going to take that and put it into a string format again. Now, you may get confused by this, as I do every time I use it. So I just look at the code that I've done, and then I'm reminded of the difference between dump and load, because I know one does one thing and the other does the other, and I tend to forget. So I end up looking at code that I've written. Anyway, that is how you translate, reminding ourselves of this picture. That's how you translate to and from a JSON string, which is formatted like this, into Python data structures, and from a Python data structure into a JSON formatted string. So I suppose I should show you the result of running this. This is the result you see. I have these print statements in here. I print out the original file. This is just a string that it's printing. It has its own new lines, etc. in it. Then I go ahead and I do the pretty version. That's this one right here, where I do the double translation. I load the string and then I dump the string, and this is a printing of what that looks like at the end. And then the last thing that I do is I just do the comparison and I print out that it worked because they're the same as the original. So let's review what we talked about. In this section here, M02 files, we're talking about going to and from Python data structures into JSON, XML, YAML, also CSV, and vice versa. What does that actually look like with JSON, which is our topic here? This is Python data, this is JSON data, this is a string, remember? But basically it's very similar. And how are we doing that? We're using load s in order to take JSON formatted string and put it into Python data structures, and dump s to take Python data structure and put it into JSON formatted string. And this is the code that we used. We first read we didn't read it in, but we have this inventory thing, and we're going to change that into JSON and then write it out. Then we're going to read it back into JSON inventory. We will do a load in order to take the JSON inventory and put it into Python format, and then we will compare the two. And that's how you go back and forth between Python and JSON. Hopefully that made sense. If not, let me know. And as always, thanks for listening.